Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for joining us. Well, the views of Pennsylvania voters 50 and over, but first, guess what? It's just about 2 weeks until Election Day. We'll get to that and more after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, we can't be this close to Election Day and not talk about some of the important elections in this state, particularly the U.S. Senate race and the governor's contest. Joining me to talk about that and more is Stephen Caruso. He's the Capitol reporter for Spotlight Pennsylvania, and Tom Lehman. He's the Capitol reporter for WGAL News 8. All right, Tom, let's start with you. The big news this week was, of course, the release of this healthcare report from John Fetterman's physician. And what did he say, and what does it mean?
Well, Terry, the letter itself was from his doctor talking about his recovery from the stroke that he had back in May. And the highlights really are that he's recovering well, according to the doctor. Still having, I believe, what were characterized as auditory processing issues. It has to do with, I believe, how he picks up some words.
Hearing, is it? Yeah.
Sure. But one of the things is that the doctor said, listen, he's doing a lot better than he was back in May, especially when it comes on some of those communication issues. But the other thing that he said at the very bottom was that John Fetterman is able to serve in public office. He's doing a lot better. He's healthy enough as long as he keeps up doing the healthcare procedures that he's doing to help take care of himself.
Sure. Well, the bottom line here is then Dr. Oz, who had been, I think, went from double digits behind down to, about 3 points behind, was using that as a big issue. And Fetterman had been out on the campaign trail, and he did stumble over some words, and that became an issue. So what did Oz ultimately say?
The reaction from Oz's campaign was simply, hey, we're glad to hear that Lieutenant Governor Fetterman is doing a lot better. We think that's cause for maybe having another debate.
Why not?
They seemed like, hey, let's get more direct in terms of the interactions between the two.
But there were other issues that the Oz campaign was using, particularly his service on I'm talking about Fetterman's service as chair of the Pardons Board.
Yeah, the Oz campaign has been running a lot of ads and also national Republican groups looking at John Fetterman's time as chair of the Board of Pardons. He's pushed through, a vote has to be unanimous on this board to get someone out. But, he's focused on trying to get people who were, wrongfully accused out of prison. There have been a lot of ads that have attacked this, and some of his other focus on wanting to make sure the Board of Pardons works well. I think those attacks might be working. I've spent some time talking to voters recently. And there have found a lot of Republicans who are even pretty willing to vote for Josh Shapiro in the governor's race. But then they get to the Senate race and they're kind of like, well, Fetterman scares me, though I kind of like his energy, I like his vibe. But also then Dr. Oz too, they have some concerns with, because a lot of those negative attacks that he's maybe not from Pennsylvania, that he's a Hollywood elite, also scares them.
Right?
Yeah. So I think that watching how much ticket splitting happens between the governor's race and the Senate race is something I'm really interested to see when we have results.
That's a good point. I think, typically we've had increased straight party voting, but it looks like we could have a good bit of ticket splitting this year.
Sure. I mean, I know people who live in southeastern PA who are Republicans, and they have serious reservations about voting for Doug Mastriano. Yeah. But they've said they might be more open to voting for Mehmet Oz. I think it's just going to come down to how they're feeling a little bit closer to Election Day.
So I guess the big deal right now is which party turns out its voters. Remember, we still have this national situation with inflation as the #1 issue, the economy, obviously, and where that all goes, which party turns out its voters could also be really important. Well, they're all going to turn out their voters, but which party proportionately turns out more?
Yeah, and I think it's, that's the big question. I feel like everyone, once you get into the last 2 weeks, it like almost reverses. Operatives are spending all their time telling you how good their chances are, and then once you get the last 2 weeks, everyone's like, oh God, all I see are red flags. Or I've had Democrats saying, I'm concerned about a lack of enthusiasm. I have Republicans who are like, I'm concerned that they're not going to back our candidate. So, last 2 weeks to go, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, it's getting down to the wire. All right, we're going to run to a break. We can't. I can't let you folks, you two leave without talking about Mastriano and Josh Shapiro. We'll get to that subject after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, I'm chatting with Tom Lehman and Stephen Caruso, two reporters that have been covering the statewide elections since they began. Stephen, let me start with you. Doug Mastriano and, of course, the current Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. Doug Mastriano is a state senator from the 33rd District out in Franklin County. So what's the latest on that campaign?
So far, polling average shows Josh Shapiro with about a 10-point lead. I think that we're going to have to see if that holds. There have been some polling misses. There sometimes seems to be people who aren't responding to these polls. But, in my time talking to voters, I have met a lot of Republicans who seem genuinely uncertain about his candidacy, who don't seem to want to vote for him. He's advocating, his Christian faith is really important to him. That uses to justify, for instance, a 6-week abortion ban. Experts have called it Christian nationalism, which is, an ideology that focuses on America as a Christian nation. So I think that there have also been tons of money, because Josh Shapiro has the most money raised by any gubernatorial candidate spent on pushing this message to voters. Mastriano hasn't had a lot of that money to fire back and define himself. So, it seems like that strategy so far has succeeded for Shapiro.
In order for Mastriano to do better, of course, his base of support comes from Trump's, the most loyal supporters in the state. He does have to expand that base into the suburbs, and has not been easy for him to do.
Sure, and he's had a couple rallies in, suburban Philadelphia, some of the suburbs around bigger metropolitan market areas. But, I think that's been the challenge for him through this campaign since May. Remember, he won that primary by plurality. It's something that he's been really trying to, I think, claw more support from to rally up Republicans. And it's funny, when you listen to his speeches on the road, rather than coming out with a big, broad message to people, I think there are some broad issues he's addressing in those speeches. He is very much focused on, we have to take back our state from the from the Democrats. And I think that's the message he's going with. Whereas I think when you look at Josh Shapiro, it's more of a broad coalition he's trying to build, at least through the messaging directly to voters.
Yeah. Now it seems like Mastriano's past positions on things have sort of dominated the campaign, as opposed to what I'll call contemporary or issues of the day.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And some of that's been that Mastriano, for a while, was very content to keep repeating his greatest hits. I mean, when he ran for governor in the primary, in the Republican primary, I think a lot of people almost looked at him like, oh, he'll cap at 20%, he won't win. He has a lot of really big supporters, but they're not going to come out. And in that primary, pretty much all he did was talk about, I oppose COVID lockdowns. I tried to overturn the 2020 election. I'm very opposed to abortion. Hammered these themes, and that got him 44% of the vote in the Republican nomination. So since then, he's kind of kept to that same strategy of, this got me this far, so why should I change? And I think that strategy we're seeing more and more from people who are just like, I just got to get my base and keep it and see if I can run with it.
Isn't that the critical question? Has he been able to expand his base that just has not been picked up? I mean, I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's an important question.
You know, I would say some Republicans seem to have been falling in line. I know just this past week, Lou Barletta, his closest competitor in the primary, endorsed him in the general election. But I think there's also some question as to how much that really matters to somebody that was already going to vote for Doug Mastriano. They were already going to do that.
But there are more than 12 Republican former office holders, state lawmakers, and members of Congress who've endorsed Josh Shapiro. So it's in a sense goes both ways. Sure.
Yeah, Shapiro, I think, has put an emphasis on trying to build that that coalition building. We get press released every time there's this new slate of Republican endorsements for Shapiro. I wonder if we're going to see more before the election. We're getting to that time where if there's more current office holders, they might not be as worried about political blowback to get it. So, and I think Mastriano has tried to expand his base. Like, he spent a lot of time recently talking about parental rights, which is his kind of code for getting parents more involved in education, to try and get critical race theory, to try and get gender theory out of schools. But I don't know if that's I don't know if that expands his base as much as he thinks.
And the question is, he now has a little bit of money, and I think he's done a television commercial. But the fact of the matter is, has he reached enough voters?
Sure, and the biggest difference is, I think, you look at the advertisements he's putting out now, but you compare the timeline to how long Josh Shapiro has been running ads. Remember, Josh Shapiro took a little bit of flack back in the May primary because he put out advertisements that were viewed as an in-kind contribution to Doug Mastriano by calling him the Trump candidate. Yeah. So, I think Shapiro has had like a months-long head start on the TV advertising.
That's a good point.
And, I think Senator Mastriano is certainly getting his name out there a little bit more on the airwaves with advertisements, but certainly a lot of people have already seen him because of Josh Shapiro's commercials.
All right, thanks for coming in and for the update. All right, coming up, the views of Pennsylvania voters 50 and older. That's pretty important. Back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Welcome back. Well, AARP has had Fabrizio Ward and Impact Research do 2 surveys for them dealing with Pennsylvania voters 50 and over. And we're going to chat about them with Tony Fabrizio, who's a partner in Fabrizio Ward. All right, Tony, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Terry.
All right, I'll tell you, the views of voters 50 and over are particularly important, if for no other reason, in the high turnout rate that older voters tend to have. And you did a poll in Pennsylvania in June and now in October. And I want to chat with you about a couple of the important issues that have been identified and get the sense about what the voters in our state think. Let's talk about, not arguably, what has been the most important issue in virtually every poll conducted in the United States, and that's inflation and rising prices.
Absolutely, Terry. Well, first, you raised the point about voters 50 plus being important in the state of Pennsylvania. They're important everywhere, particularly in off-year elections. But in Pennsylvania, in both of our surveys, we found that anywhere between 61 and 62% of the voters that vote will be age 50 and older. So, that is a substantial portion of voters that the candidates need to address. And when you look at what their issue concerns are, not surprisingly, they're a little bit different than voters that are 18 to 49, but in some ways they're similar. So what we found in our survey is, in both surveys actually, that the top concern is, as you pointed out, inflation and rising prices. No surprise there. And it is the same as we find with younger voters, But right behind inflation and rising prices, we find Social Security and Medicare is the second concern for them. And that's just about what we found in our earliest survey. And right behind that, we find abortion rights is the third issue in their list of importance to them. And that's up a little bit from our last survey, not surprisingly, in the wake of the Roe ruling from the Supreme Court. But when you look underneath the surface, while those may be the top three issues, when you look, there are real partisan differences here. When you look among Republicans that are 50 and older, you see that economic issues, crime, law and order, and immigration tend to be more important. When you look among Democrats that are 50 and older, it's abortion, Social Security are more important, and independents are kind of split. So inflation is the top issue for them, but then you'll find that Social Security and abortion are kind of right behind it. So it's kind of a mix here, and what polarizes out these voters based on what's most important to them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Terry. No, go ahead.
Well, and one of the things that we've done in our surveys is we've kind of, because of the attention that the abortion issue has been given and the inflation issue, is we've kind of pitted them against each other to see at the end of the day, when forced to choose between what's driving their votes, we found that among voters 50 plus here, inflation and rising prices is a majority of these voters would say that that's driving their vote over abortion. Yet, we still see that Social Security and Medicare for these voters is very much on top of mind and very much injected into the political discourse. Yeah. And that's something that candidates can't forget here.
We're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk with you about a couple of other subjects that you've dealt with: honesty in government, voting rights, election security. These are issues that obviously everybody has an interest in, but let's find out what voters 50 and over think, and we'll do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, voters 50 and older, that's the subject for the last segment and this segment. All right, Tony, I'll tell you something. We talking earlier about turnout, and I think we're going to have a record turnout for midterm elections, not just from voters 50 and over, but for all voters, all age voters.
Absolutely, there's no question. One of the things that we're seeing is when we do our surveys, Terry, we do them from registered voters lists. So we know what the vote history is of the voters. And we're seeing, depending on the state, we're seeing as many as 1 in 5 of the people that screen into our surveys are not previous midterm voters. There may be new registrants from the last midterm, et cetera, but a bunch of them are presidential voters that never voted in midterms but are coming in. And the other thing that's interesting is while turnout may go up, here in our Pennsylvania poll, we found that there's a sizable gap in motivation between voters 50 plus and voters 18 to 49, with obviously voters 50 plus having significantly higher motivation to vote.
Yeah. I want to talk about immigration and border security, but before I get to that, let's talk about things that we see in a lot of polls, something that gets referred to as honesty in government, voting rights, and election security. All those things get sort of wrapped together by the voters.
One of the things we find it a little bit differently. Voting security and election integrity. It's interesting. Voting security oftentimes will be something that Democrats rally around. Election integrity is something Republicans, or voting rights will Democrats, and election integrity something Republicans will rally around. Honesty in government is something that shifts depending on who the party in power is, okay? So when Republicans control government, we find Democrats talking more about honesty in government. When it's opposite, we'll find Democrats talking about honesty in government. But here, what we've noticed is over the past couple of years, last several years, is that you'll get Democrats and Republicans, obviously independents as well, citing honesty in government as kind of like a catch-all where they're just upset about politics and politicians writ large.
Yeah. Well, the point I was trying to make wasn't not that there wasn't differences, but in fact, these are issues that come up in a lot of polls as important. And sometimes it's just said politicians, if you open-ended question, the state of politics in America.
Well, there's no question about that. There is the level of dissatisfaction. One of the things that is true on a national basis is if you look at the leadership, okay, whether it's President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Schumer, Leader McConnell, Leader McCarthy, all of them have negative images among voters overall. Yeah. None of them are liked. And so it's not like, they love their politicians. They don't. It's a lot of cases, it's nose holding. And in fact, we see it here. At the end of these races, we're going to wind up with at least 3 of these major candidates being underwater in their images, but one of them is going to win. Yeah.
Well, another important issue that comes out in the polls is immigration and border security. What are the views of voters 50 and over on those issues?
Well, it isn't one of their top issues, but it is one certainly that, while not top of mind, it's one that evokes pretty strong reactions among voters. And one of the reasons likely why it is not more top of mind is there isn't as much attention paid to it as there have been some other issues. But from a range of different research that we've done, voters, older voters, are concerned because of the linkage to personal safety. There's a concern about drugs. There's a concern about illegals committing crimes, et cetera, et cetera. And in Pennsylvania, crime is one of the issues that's being discussed ad nauseum in the campaign, particularly in the Senate race. And so you could see that concern being stoked more, even though it's not a direct connection.
Yeah, we only have about a minute left. In general, health care, not Social Security and Medicare, but health care is also important.
Yes, and that is generally related to the cost of health care. And particularly with voters over the age of 50, although voters over the age of 65, a little bit less so because of Medicare. But one of the things we find that helps drive that is the cost of prescription drugs.
All right, look, I have to interrupt you. Our time is up.
No problem.
I want to thank you for coming in and giving us this data. All right,
we'll
see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, stay well.